We have been studying verses 8, 9 and 10 of the text that is titled Aurobindo Upanishad. And as we have seen before, Aurobindo wrote this originally in Sanskrit, and we have been referring to the translation for support, but also that we recognize there are limitations in the English translation, and where necessary, we have been drawing from the original Sanskrit for the deeper nuances that Sri Aurobindo himself communicates to us. In verse 8, Sri Aurobindo gave us three perspectives symbolically in the image of the sun. Three perspectives of the reality of the world in relation to its origin. In the first, it was the image of the sun reflected in calm waters or in restless waters where the reflection breaks up. The sun is real, the light is real, and the reflection also is real. In the second image, it is the light of the sun as it shines out, filling the solar world with its force, as if running. The light is real, the sun is real, and therefore the movement of manifestation is also real. In the third image, it is the flaming disk of the sun as distinct from the sunness of which it is an expression. The sunness is beyond the form of the disk, and that sunness, the real sun, is real, but the form in the shape of the disk is also real. The light that emerges from it is also real, and everything that follows, including the reflection, is real. And then he says, similarly, here the world Brahman is the true light of the divine. It is the real light of the reality, not the divine in himself, but still he himself only. And then we saw four perceptions of the divine corresponding to what was earlier given to us in symbolic form with the pictures of the sun. So the lowest of the four, this is the supreme Maya. And Maya we saw as that creative power by which the one appears in multiplicity. And corresponding to the image given to us of the sunlight reflected in restless waters becoming fragmented, multiple. The next perception of the divine, the greatness of the yoga of the Lord of Yoga, Sri Krishna. It is the greatness of the yoga, the power of yoga by which the whole creation emerges, is released and spreads out as the light of the sun spreads out. The third image, perception of the divine, is his blissful leela of his consciousness force. And dwelling here on that consciousness force, which is himself in his self-awareness, the form that emerges out of himself when he knows himself, corresponding to the disk of the sun emerging into form out of the sunness, which is formless. And then the fourth perception of the divine, this is the inconceivable working of the Supreme, and this goes back all the way to that essential sunness of the sun transcending form, which cannot be conceived by mind, which cannot be explained or expressed rationally, and yet which flows to express itself in this extraordinary manifestation. We dwelt on this fourfold perception of the divine and saw also last time a passage from Sri Aurobindo's Secret of the Veda, in which exactly this pattern of description is given, involving almost exactly the same terms and the same words, the same ideas. But in our study, we have been dwelling, meditating on these verses as we are intended to in any Upanishadic text, for deeper and deeper insights and perceptions. And especially when we dwell on the Sanskrit text, there are nuances which are lost in the translation. And there are two important ideas here which we will dwell on before we move on, we proceed with the text. In the Sanskrit, as in most of the old languages, every object is given a gender. It is either masculine, feminine, or neutral. And so it is. And so it is with all things of the higher reality also, not only of the material world. In the higher domains, we find in particular that the presiding consciousness of the divine is always described in masculine terms, whereas the power of consciousness released, moving into manifestation to create, is described in feminine terms, he and she. In this text, this distinction is used skillfully by Sri Aurobindo, although it passes through suggestively. When we dwell on the idea, we find there is a huge revelation waiting behind that subtle use of the words. In the Sanskrit, in the description of this fourfold perception of the divine, in the Sanskrit he uses the feminine term, Esha, not Esha. Esha para maya. If we had to translate literally, it would not be as in this text, this is the supreme Maya, it would be, she is the supreme Maya. In the same way, the next, it says, she is the greatness of the yoga, of the mysterious Lord of yoga, Sri Krishna. And next, she is the blissful Leela of his consciousness force. And the last is also in the feminine sense, what is translated as inconceivable working of the Supreme. We saw that the word used in Sanskrit is gati, movement, speed. And this is the speed which transcends mind's capacity to rationalize, to understand, the transcending speed of the divine expression. And that also is feminine. So throughout there is this underlying sense of she as the creative power that flows out of the Lord. And we find immediately this double sense of the Lord, the Supreme Lord, and the Divine Shakti, the Divine Mother who creates the universe, the Mother of the cosmos, who herself becomes the cosmos in her creative movement. So this is something which is lost in this English translation, but we find in the entire text suddenly here the predominance of the principle of the divine creative power as the Divine Mother and as the Divine Shakti. So this is one important idea that is suggested in this just by the use of this one shift of the gender. The second idea is the totality of the vision, that we do not see four separate perceptions of the divine, but it is one single movement which appears to us in this fourfold expression. You will remember that the Brahman is described as fourfold, and the reason is that we can know him in four very distinct ways, because he chooses to know himself in these four distinct ways. We started the verse itself with Om. And Om, you recall, is the U and Ma and the silence, representing the four gradations of Brahman. And in this fourfold description of the perception of the divine, we actually find exactly that fourfold movement. There is that Para, the supreme, inconceivable working, which goes beyond all description. And then the next is, she is the blissful Leela of his consciousness force. And at that point, it is the concentration of the Brahman preparing to lose himself forth into manifestation. And this would correspond to the poise of Brahman in the trance state or sleep state, as it is translated. And then there is the description of she as the greatness of the yoga, of the mysterious Lord of Yoga, and the movement releasing forth by the yoga, casting out the universe, corresponding to the next gradation of Brahman, which is described as the dream state. The Brahman dreaming himself out into forms, into manifestation, but in that there is a deep subjectivity. There is still the sense of a dream, because everything is held in a fluid, plastic play of possibilities. There is not yet the condensation into a rigid, fixed manifestation. And that comes in the last step, when we describe here as she is the supreme Maya. And in this last step, it is the waking poise of Brahman, where all is seen in distinctness of separate forms. This objectivized world in which a fixed result is seen. When we move back a single step in the domain of the sleep state in the dream state of Brahman, all possibilities are crowding, struggling to manifest themselves, and each of them exists simultaneously. But when we move into this external most status of Brahman, when he objectifies himself, then only one of those possibilities is finally expressed into manifestation. The character of this objective world is everything is fixed, separated, distinct. And the sense of the creative power of Maya is strongest here, because all is measured out into finiteness, distinction, and separation. So there is this fourfold description, but it is still one single Brahman, which is described here as the world Brahman. So in the Sanskrit text, it is Tatheha Jagat Brahma Satya Prakasho Bhagavatah. In the same way, having given the analogies of the sun, in exactly the same way, the world Brahman is truth light of the divine. So the whole of the world, as we see manifested here in its most external form and in its deeper domains of the inner realities of the subtle worlds and in the deep concentration of Brahman, of the creative poise, and in his transcendence. The whole is a single vision, described as world Brahman, as truth light, Bhagavatah. And last time we dwelt on this sense of Bhagavan as the divine in his poise of enjoyment. Here it becomes immensely important in this text, because all the rest of the text from this point on is going to dwell on the world bliss and the world as manifestation of the divine bliss. And Bhagavan is that. In the Secret of the Veda, Sri Aurobindo has an entire chapter titled Bhaga Savitri, the enjoyer. And although we read a part of that last time, I thought it worth reading a little more, where Sri Aurobindo elaborates on this sense of the delight of things and the delight of creation. He begins by saying first that Bhaga means enjoyment or the enjoyer. Let me read the whole text instead of summarizing this. In this hymn of Shavashva to Savitri, we see both the functions of Bhaga and his oneness with Surya Savitri. For it is to the creative Lord of Truth that the hymn is addressed, to Surya. But to Surya specifically in his form as Bhaga, as the Lord of enjoyment. L capital and E capital. Even enjoyment here is not the human sense of enjoyment, but the way the divine enjoys, which will be described shortly. The word Bhaga means enjoyment or the enjoyer. And this sense is the one held especially appropriate to the divine name Bhaga. Is emphasized by the use of bhojanam. In the verse, the word bhojanam is used, means literally eating, food. Bhaga, Saubhagam in the verses of the hymn. Savitri, we have seen, means creator, capital C. And especially in the sense of producing, emitting from the unmanifest and bringing out into the manifest. Throughout the hymn, there is a constant dwelling upon this root sense of the word, which it is impossible to render adequately in a translation. In the very first verse, there is a covert play of the kind, for bhojanam means both enjoyment and food, and it is intended to be conveyed that the enjoyment of Savitri is soma, from the same root su, to produce, press out, distill. Soma, the food of divine beings, the supreme distilling, highest production of the great producer. What the Rishi seeks is the enjoyment in all created things of the immortal and immortalizing Ananda. We have dwelt on this idea, which is at the very heart of the Vedic symbolism, that all of life is imaged as the forest and the trees of experience, whose vines carry deep within the sap of the divine delight. And in order to be able to partake of that divine delight, the vines have to be pressed to release the juice, and then that juice has to be distilled, purified, and then to be offered to the gods. And only when they have partaken, then the human being enjoys them in their enjoyment. And this is the deep, profound idea that behind every form, behind every experience, behind every movement of the world, it is the original divine bliss which is expressing itself, but in the form of expression, the form conceals. And therefore, there is a whole process by which we must cut through the form and appearances to touch the bliss behind. But it is to enjoy that bliss, and as a nourishment of that bliss, that we have come in this world. The psychic being, in particular, is always turning to the divine in things, and it is in that contact with the divine that it draws the nourishment, the bhojanam, literally the food, even as it is the enjoyment. So the experience of the psychic being, as we briefly discussed last time, is this enjoyment of the world play, but at the same time it is nourishment through all experience, and it grows through each experience as it enjoys the play of the divine bliss. The next paragraph elaborates, it is this Ananda which is that enjoyment of the divine producer, capital P, of Surya Savitri, the supreme result of the truth, capital T. For truth is followed as the path to the divine beatitude. The way to realize that divine beatitude, the expression and participation of the divine bliss, is through the truth. For truth is followed as the path to the divine beatitude. This Ananda is the highest, the best enjoyment. It disposes all aright. For once the Ananda, the divine delight in all things, is attained, it sets right all the distortions, all the evil of the world. It carries man through to the goal. If by the truth and right of things we arrive at the Ananda, by Ananda also we arrive at the right and truth of things. So this is the double play. Through the pursuit of the divine truth, in more religious terms we use the phrase the divine law, but the sense of law is more of a mental construction, because we are reducing the truth to fixed forms. But it is important to understand how the religions had to express that divine truth in a manner accessible to the human mind, and so they reduce it more to the domain of law. But behind that, the deeper sense is the divine truth. And the divine truth is the spontaneous expression of the divine will. At each moment, it is new, it is fresh, and it is ever changing. So the pursuit of the divine truth, and as we try to live more and more by that, is the path through which we attain to the divine bliss. And as we attain to the divine bliss and share in the divine bliss, everything begins spontaneously to fall in a right relation, and we have the manifestation of the divine truth in form, in life. So there is this double movement of ascending through the pursuit of truth to the divine Ananda, and by the divine Ananda manifesting that truth into creation. It is to the divine creator, capital C, in the name and form of Bhaga, that this human capacity for the divine and right enjoyment of all things belongs. So this capacity for the divine and right enjoyment of all things is there in humanity, but it belongs to that divine creator in the name and form of Bhaga. It is to the divine creator in the name and form of Bhaga that this human capacity for the divine and right enjoyment of all things belongs. When he is embraced by the human mind and heart and vital forces and physical being, when this divine form is received into himself by man, then the Ananda of the world manifests itself. And this is the essence of the Vedic yoga, that which we seek to realize is already held as the divine form, and that divine form and presence has to be received in us. And as the divine presence establishes itself in us, as His form moves our form, fills our form, and expresses itself through our form, we are divinized, and at the same time, the divine manifests. So there is a double movement which is described in the Veda as an exchange. In our self-surrender to the divine, in our self-sacrifice of giving ourselves to the divine, we grow because we can then embody the divine. But also the divine grows because then He is fulfilled in His manifestation. His manifestation is made perfect in His image. So this double movement of mutual growth is one of the key ideas of the Vedic yoga. And this is what he describes. When he is embraced, and in the embracement, of course, we have to reach out, open ourselves, reach out to him in exclusion of all things, and draw him into ourselves, give ourselves to him. And the whole movement of yoga is captured in that single word. When he is embraced by the human mind and heart and vital forces and physical being. So it has to be an embracement not just by a part in us, but the totality of the whole being. All parts, the whole of the human being must open, and it is an integral embracement and therefore an integral transformation following the integral surrender that is aimed at in the Vedic yoga also. So when he is embraced by the human mind and heart and vital forces and physical being, when this divine form is received into himself by man, then the ananda of the world manifests itself. In other words, by our turning in aspiration and self-surrender to that divine being, which is Bhaga Savitri, the divine enjoyer, we receive him in ourselves, in all these parts, in our mind, in our heart, in our vital energies, and even in our physical being. And as we receive him into us, he manifests his ananda in the world, and it is the ananda of the world. But the idea is, the ananda belongs to him. It is to the divine creator in the name and form of Bhaga that this human capacity for the divine and right enjoyment of all things belongs. It is not ours. And you see in this formulation, all of the key processes and requirements of the yoga are also captured. The abnegation of our ego, it is not ours, it is his. In opening ourselves, there is the movement of the aspiration. But in our opening ourselves exclusively to him, there is the movement of rejection of all that is not in tune with that aspiration, with the Lord that we seek. And in receiving him, there is the movement of the surrender and the transformation that follows from his manifestation in us. So the result of this, nothing can limit, nothing can diminish, neither God nor demon, friend nor enemy, event nor sensation, whatever pleasure this divine enjoyer takes in things, in whatever vessel or object of his enjoyment. So when we partake of his enjoyment, it is not our enjoyment, it is his enjoyment that we share. And his enjoyment cannot be limited, cannot be diminished by anything in creation, neither God nor demon, friend nor enemy, event nor sensation. And what cannot be diminished? Whatever pleasure this divine enjoyer takes in things, in whatever vessel or object of his enjoyment. Literally, in every vessel and every object of his enjoyment, because everything is his enjoyment and made for his enjoyment. So, he continues, for nothing can diminish or hedge in or hurt his luminous self-empire, Swarajyam, his perfect possession of himself in infinite being, infinite delight, and the vastnesses of the order of the truth. This is literally a translation of the verses of the Veda, but the key ideas here. Nothing can diminish or hedge in or hurt. These are the three things by which distortion takes place and the fall into ignorance. Remember, it was the similar idea in the Isha Upanishad that we studied, that it is limitation, narrowing, which is the cause of ignorance. And because of the ignorance, there is the loss and separation from the divine enjoyment. But what is it that is the characteristic of this loss? Diminish, to become narrow, to become less than infinite, to hedge, to put limits, to try to contain, to try to cut out. And this is the character of the human ego. Although we are a part of the totality of the universe, the human ego wants to cut up ourselves, our consciousness, our existence, our identity into separateness. So the hedging, the formation of a border, or hurt. Hurt is a more subtle form of limitation. It brings in an incapacity to be full, incapacity to deal with all possibilities and all extremes. So, nothing can diminish or hedge in or hurt his luminous self-empire. It's the literal translation of the Sanskrit word Swarajyam. Swa is of oneself, Rajyam is rule, so literally translated as self-rule of the empire. In the Bhagavad Gita, this idea is put forth in these terms, that in order to be king of one's own empire, that is ourselves, our own being, it goes the other way. In order to be king of the world, you have to be master of yourself. In order to become Samarat, Lord of all things, you must become first Swarat, master of one's own empire. But the Lord, and the reason is this, the Lord himself is master of himself because the whole world is himself. And it is in him that this separation merges. Self-rule and all rule become one. So it is this idea which is played with. He is Lord of himself, but himself is also the whole cosmos. So his luminous self-empire, Swarajyam, his perfect possession of himself. What is to be Lord? What is the true sense of lordship? That everything is yours. Nothing can ever be not yours. But in that ownership and possession, everything is perfectly responding to your will. Nothing can oppose your will. So his perfect possession of himself in infinite being, infinite delight, and the vastnesses of the order of the truth. So it takes three poises. Infinite being, because all totality of existence is himself and it is infinite. But from the poise of being, there is the movement of the delight, and the movement of delight is the beginning of the creation. So the delight also is infinite in his infinite being. And then the movement to create and the vastnesses of the order of the truth, the right arrangement, the perfect expression of his delight in movement of form. So in the description in the Veda, there are three terms used: Satyam, Ritam and Brihat. The truth, the right, the vast, as Sri Aurobindo translates it. And there is the truth in essential being, which is infinite. And then there is the right, which is the perfect expression in which that truth articulates itself as it moves to manifestation in perfect rhythm of perfect harmony, also always infinite. And then the vast, because the multiplicity of manifestation is also infinite and vast, always full, always complete, nothing left out. So a similar sense is held here, but the infinite delight is emphasized. And the next paragraph describes how this takes form in the rishi, in the seeker. Therefore it is he that brings the seven delights, Saptaratna, to the giver of the sacrifice. He looses them forth on us, for they are all there in the world as in the divine being, in ourselves also, and have only to be loosed forth on our outer consciousness. So the idea is, just as in the world, the bliss is always there behind the appearances, so too within us, the divine bliss is always there behind the appearances. It needs only to be released. And it is this Bhaga, as the Lord, the enjoyer, who entering in us releases that. So he looses them forth on us, for they are all there in the world as in the divine being, in ourselves also, and have only to be loosed forth on our outer consciousness. The rich and varied amplitude of this sevenfold delight, perfect on all the planes of our being, is the bhaga, enjoyment or portion of Bhaga Savitri in the completed sacrifice. And it is that varied wealth which the rishi seeks for himself and his fellows in the sacrifice by the acceptance of the divine enjoyer. So there are several important ideas just by the use of the suggestive word. First, that the delight is sevenfold, and this means the cosmos, which is sevenfold, is entirely a play of his sevenfold delight. And in us, because we are a microcosmos, is also the sevenfold delight meant to be manifested, rich and varied amplitude. It is not a barren, flat expression, but richly varied and varying constantly. And yet, perfect on all the planes of our being. And this is the bhaga. Literally, bhaga means portion. But it is, in the sense, a variation from the word bhaga, from the enjoyment. Therefore, the portion of the enjoyment given to us, or which we share in, of his totality of delight of creation. And I skip one sentence, but then he goes on to say, Ananda is creative. It is Jana, the delight that gives birth to life and world. Only let the things loosed forth on us be of the creation conceived in the terms of the truth, and let all that belongs to the falsehood, to the evil dream created by the ignorance of the divine truth, be dismissed, dispelled away from our conscious being. So the affirmation which the Rishi makes is not only of the establishment of the Ananda, but also the removal of all that is a distortion of the truth, which is falsehood, which would limit or distort the ananda. And further description is of the participation in this divine play. But you see here the idea that the bliss is the cause of the birth of life and the world. And skipping again a little bit, an important idea that is given here is the ananda owing to that freedom is capable of being in them universal. So this idea is we need to become in our own consciousness sufficiently vast and universal to be able to share in that universal ananda. And at first, although a portion of it may be given to us, eventually we must widen out to receive the totality of that ananda and share in his full bliss. And the last paragraph places Bhaga in between as the creative movement. Surya Savitri, who is Bhaga, stands between the infinite and the created worlds, within us and without. Always in the Veda, this double image is held. All that is described in the universe is also at the same time within us, because we are the micro-universe. And Bhaga stands between the infinite and the created worlds, because it is by his bliss that the worlds are formed. So even within us, the same truth exists. When we ascend in our consciousness towards the infinite, it is Bhaga who stands in between. All things that have to be born in the creative consciousness, he receives into the Vijnana. There he puts it into its right place in the divine rhythm by the knowledge that listens and receives the word as it descends. And so he loses it forth into the movement of things. So this is a very important function, and I will dwell on this because the next verse of our text, verse 9, actually catches this. And that's why we see these strong parallels between the Vedic text and Sri Aurobindo's Upanishad. So whatever has to be born in the creative consciousness, Bhaga receives, but in what consciousness does he receive? The Vijnana, the creative supermind, which holds the whole creative movement and translates the oneness into the multiplicity. And there he puts it into its right place in the divine rhythm by the knowledge. The Vijnana is also the comprehensive, embracing knowledge of the divine, in which everything is put in right place, in right relation of perfect harmony to all things. And from there it is released in perfect rhythm. So the Ritam, from the Satyam, Ritam, Brihat, the Ritam is this perfect arrangement of the truth. But literally in common usage, Ritam is also the rhythm, particularly the rhythms of the seasons, the rhythm in which things are perfectly expressed cyclically in manifestation, and given form as word with a capital W, as it descends, and so he loses it forth into the movement of things. And this losing forth, remember, was the root sound Su of Surya, by which the release of the light of the sun takes place from the truth of the sun through the bliss of his self-expression. So there is a little more, maybe we just read it for the mantric value, not dwelling more on it. When in us each creation of the active Ananda comes thus out of the unmanifest, received and heard rightly of the knowledge in the faultless rhythm of things, then is our creation that of Bhaga Savitri, and all the births of that creation, our children, our offspring, are things of the delight. This is the accomplishment of Bhaga in man, his full portion of the world sacrifice. And we move back now to the text we are studying, and the very next verse, verse 9, puts it thus: all this, the description, the vision, the great revelation that has been placed before us, the truth of it, that from the highest to the most material, everything is real and true, and world Brahman himself. All this is phenomenally true, but false in reality for the satisfaction of the mind. For the comprehensive knowledge, it must be said, there is nothing unreal in the real Brahman. So this is how the translation is given. The Sanskrit is more profound. It goes like this: Sarvam idam arthata satyam. Sarvam, all, idam, this. So all this. And when it says all this, everything which is part of our world experience. Arthata, in essence, in truth, in meaning. Satyam, true. So all this, in essence, in meaning, is true. Then, para arthata, from the highest meaning, from the highest truth, asatyamiti, untrue, unreal, manastushthyartham, to the mind's satisfaction, it appears unreal when put in relation to the highest truth. And this is the experience which all spiritual pursuit has to pass through. When it has a glimpse of the spiritual realities, they are so extraordinary, so perfect, so beautiful, so complete and overwhelming in their reality, that in relation to that, this appears to be not true, unreal, fickle, vague, insubstantial, dreamlike almost. But he says, in relation to that highest truth, this looks like illusory, untrue, for the satisfaction of the mind. Because it is when the mental consciousness looks at that and looks at this, it sees the huge gap and says, this is obviously not that, and therefore not true, not real, not divine. But, and this is the next phrase, Vijnanartham uchyatam nahi kinchidapi asatyam satye brahmani. Vijnanartham. So there was the appearance of things as they are, and from the higher appearance or the higher reality as we see. But there is another way of looking at it, Vijnana Artham, by the perception of Vijnana. And Vijnana is, precisely as we saw in the text, the means by which Bhaga, or the consciousness of knowledge in which Bhaga holds everything which has to be released. Vijnana is supermind. In the comprehensiveness of the supramental knowledge, which is the highest vision, not nahi, not at all, kinchid api, not even the tiniest bit, asatyam, false. So in the perspective of the Vijnana, even the tiniest bit in existence is not false. It is all true. This Vijnana is described as the highest knowledge because it is the knowledge, literally the knowledge of the self, the way the self knows himself. Briefly, we elaborate on this idea. Every time we know something, who knows really? Is it the brain cells? They cannot know. Is it the electrical pattern in our brain? That cannot know. They are only ripples. Is it the mind? mind itself cannot truly know. Because everything it knows, it can equally doubt. So, what in us is it that can truly know when we feel we know something truly? And the secret is this, that all true knowing is His true knowing. But we participate in a tiny part of His knowing when we experience a sense of true knowing. So when we know, it is in fact the Lord in us who knows and is the knowing of our experience. But we experience only a fragment and a part. If we wanted to know Him and His universe the way He knows it in His completeness, then we must rise out of mind which can know only in fragments, through higher and higher levels, until eventually in the highest level of knowing we know the universe, or we know the Lord as He knows Himself. And that is supermind. It is not only the creative power by which He releases Himself into multiplicity, but it is also His creative knowledge by which He knows Himself totally in His oneness and in His multiplicity. So this is described as the highest knowing. Vijnanartham uchyatam nahi kinchit api. Kinchit, the tiniest, littlest bit. Nahi kinchidapi asatyam. Not true. Not the tiniest bit cannot be said to be untrue for His supramental knowledge. And it ends with Satye Brahmani. Within the Brahman that is truth, the tiniest bit cannot be false to the vision of the supermind. Satye Brahmani. Brahman Himself is the truth, and within Him, therefore, nothing can be untrue. So you see how the translation catches this idea, but it loses quite a bit of this deeper nuance. All this is phenomenally true, but false in reality. This is for the satisfaction of the mind. For the comprehensive knowledge, it must be said, there is nothing unreal in the real Brahman. That is how the translator has written. And then, verse 10 affirms the bliss as the foundation of this whole creation. Evam yat prakashate jagad ananda eva tat. Whatever thus manifests is the world bliss only. In the Sanskrit text, the word is prakashate, lights up or releases as light. Whatever glows out as light or manifests as light is the world bliss only. Evam yat, thus whatever, prakashate, literally lighting out, enlightening, releasing as light. Jagad Ananda, world bliss. When you combine two words in Sanskrit, Jagad Ananda, it has multiple nuances. You translate it as world bliss, but when you hear it in Sanskrit, it carries several secondary meanings. Jagad Ananda can also carry in it the sense the world as bliss, or the world of bliss, the world that is bliss, the bliss world. All of these nuances are held. And so in the literal translation in English, we just put world hyphen bliss. But because in English it needs these particular word changes, world of and world in and so on, the multiple sense is lost when you put world hyphen bliss. But in Sanskrit, it means at the same time all these things. Jagad Ananda, world of bliss, world as bliss, bliss of world at the same time. Eva is only that, nothing else. tat, that. So whatever tiniest thing in the universe is radiated out in the world bliss is only world bliss. So whatever thus manifests is the world bliss only. And we are at this point in the central verse of the Upanishad, completed 9 before, in the 10th, and another 9 verses follow. All of them now will dwell on the experience of this world bliss for the human soul. So far you saw in the first 9 verses, it was the vision, the grand vision of the reality and totality of Brahman in all his aspects and facets and infinities of qualities. There was nowhere in it a distinction of an individual, of a soul. But from this point on, the whole Upanishad moves to the human being and his participation as the individual soul in this blissful play of the divine and the many disguises through which the divine plays out his bliss, and how the human soul himself participating in the bliss experiences the bliss in so many colors. Just skipping a few verses, I read one so that we have a sense of where this whole text is moving. Blissfully laughs the jiva, the human soul. Blissfully laughs the jiva, blissfully cries, sheds tears, blissfully throbs as if shining in dark ananda, agitated by tortures, blissfully throbs agitated by violent pleasures. For the full enjoyment of the dark, ignorant portion of that ananda, he, the jiva, conceals it, becoming obscure and ignorant. So we will see that human soul not only participates in the divine ananda as it is revealed in divinity, but participates in the divine ananda also in the darkness of ignorance, but in a different way. And that is the text which will unfold later. But behind it all, knowing that I am all blissful, he am I am one, I am infinite, I am all. One becomes all blissful, one becomes a being of bliss. This indeed is liberation. Liberated, he enjoys the enjoyment of all, enjoying all joys infinitely, and he is not separated from finites. Enjoying finites, he is not deprived of the infinite. He is one, he becomes many, and so on. For Leela indeed is the world. So all this we will enjoy later as we develop and enjoy the text itself. But this text we will continue after a gap of 2 weeks. We will have the Friday class as usual, but next Sunday I will be out of station and the Sunday after. So we continue this on the 22nd. For now we will reread the last 2 verses and meditate briefly. All this is phenomenally true, but false in reality for the satisfaction of the mind. For the comprehensive knowledge, it must be said that there is nothing unreal in the real Brahman. Whatever thus manifests is the world bliss only. Evam yat prakashate jagadananda eva tat. Evam yat prakashate jagadananda eva tat.